So, Julien Paris and his book De l'Esprit Premier, de Premier Esprit, the first spirit of the Ordo Cito. What was this book? Why had Julien Paris, abbot of Fourcarmont, written it? Because he had looked around, he, as I said, was a commendatory abbot who was actually doing a remarkably good job, who was effectively regular abbot. And he had looked around, he saw that, without any doubt, that the Benedictine tradition had degenerated. The founding document, of course, for the Cistercian tradition is the rule of St. Benedict. There is no doubt that by the 17th century, in fact by the 15th century, actually by the 14th century, actually by about the late 13th century, the rule was being abused. It had been becoming, things were becoming more and more lax. Now, do not believe everything you hear that the entire monastic order, every monastic order had become dissolute and lax by this time. This is not the case. But overall, monasticism was not what it was in the early days. The Benedictine tradition had, in fact, in many cases, monasteries were, in fact, both male and female, monasteries were lax, and the rule was not being observed, certainly not to the letter, and sometimes it varied. Sometimes it was not being followed at all, and sometimes it was being followed, as it were, in a supermarket way, i.e., we'll take this bit, we'll follow this, but we won't follow this bit, and we'll take another bit, and so on, depending on what we wanted it. So the situation was not good, there's no question about that, and the general chapter was aware of this. The general chapter could not do very much because it was like trying to stem the tide, trying to stem a tsunami. This is the way things were, and it was rather like some of the reforming popes when the papacy was in its degenerate state in the 1000s, 1100s, and so on. They tried desperately to do things, but they just couldn't. They were just unable to do it because of the circumstances of the time. The same with the general chapter. They could make all sorts of provisions, but they were just very often ignored. So yes, Benedictine monasticism and the monasticism which had been founded by Robert of Molesme and polished by Bernard of Clairvaux was in a bad condition. And you must remember that, of course, despite the fact that we have certain founding documents for the Cistercian tradition, like the Charter of Charity and the Exordium Parvum and so on, the Rule of St. Benedict remained the most important document of all. And Bernard and Robert of Molesme Robert had left Molesme, which is a Benedictine house, in order to find a stricter observance of the rule of St. Benedict. And so, of course, we have the foundation of Cito, whose real raison d'etre, reason for being, was to provide a stricter observance of this rule that Benedict had laid down. And what has to be said about the rule of St. Benedict is that of all the monastic rules, it is probably the most balanced and the most humane. It's still hard, but it is very much more balanced and humane than some of the other rules which were in circulation at the time and would be in circulation afterwards. But by the time of Julien Paris in the 17th century, things had declined. There is no doubt about that. Julien Paris therefore says things are in a really bad condition. He gives examples of this at some length. By the way, let me say right from the start, this is a wordy age, the 17th century. If you can say something in 10 pages or 100, say it in 200. And Rancé is just the same as all his confreres. They all suffer from verbal diarrhea. They can't stop them. Once they start, they just go on and on and on. And things which could in fact be said in very briefly in summary in a couple of pages, they will spend 50 pages on it with glee. So many of these books are big, thick books with small print. And Julien Paris's book on the first spirit of the Ordo Cito is no so different from this. I can't remember offhand, I don't have a copy here with me, 600-700 pages of small print. So he goes on a great length about how the order has become lax, and then he asks the question, why has it become lax? Why has it become lax? It's because it is no longer following the rule of St. Benedict. How then can we restore the first spirit of the order? The spirit of the order which we saw in St. Robert of Molem, which we saw in Stephen Harding, which we saw in, of course, Bernard himself. How do we restore that first spirit, the premier esprit of the Ordo Cita? And his logic was simple, straightforward, and inexorable. Bring back the rule of St. Benedict in its strictest sense. Do that, and you will have, and that will itself restore the order to its original first spirit. And he goes on at great length about how this, of course, is going to be done, how it will be done. But that was the essence of Julien Paris' book on the first spirit of the Ordo Cita. This is the book that Rancé read as a novice at Pessigny, and it formed his thought. He'd been reading other books as well, however. He knew, of course, the rules of St. Benedict, and later on he would produce the translation of the rules of St. Benedict and a rather fine commentary on the rule of St. Benedict. It's much more, one might say, user-friendly than his book on the holiness and duties of the monastic life. It's a good piece of work. But he had also been reading some other writers. Who were those writers? The fathers of the desert. The desert fathers. Not so much the desert mothers, there were some, but the desert fathers. And of the desert fathers particularly, actually not really a desert father, but an early ascetic, St. John of the Ladder, St. John Climacus, who had a deep, deep influence on Rancé. Now, these two things formed Rancé's basic spirituality. Julien Paris saying, return to the rule of St. Benedict as St. Benedict wrote it. But that tempered by the stern and harsh asceticism of the fathers of the desert. And as you Cistercians will all know, if you've read those at all, they were harsh. I mean, there's no question about it. This is asceticism. This is real hardline asceticism, far more hard and austere than the balanced and humane system laid out in the rule of St. Benedict. The fathers of the desert had, their souls were on fire for God. They had no concern for their bodies whatsoever. And that sometimes if you read some of their advice, and how they did and how they operated, the best thing to do is to treat this, is to ignore it entirely, in fact, because some of their advice is really extremely unwise. You have to be careful with the desert fathers. You have to be very careful with the desert fathers. Otherwise, asceticism becomes asceticism for its own sake, austerity for its own sake, which is no good to either us or to God. But this affected Rancé, and his interpretation of the rule was affected deeply by his love for the desert fathers, and especially for St. John of the Ladder. There's no question about that. Now, as I said earlier, later on, I'd like to talk a little bit more about his approach to the rule, which is far more nuanced than people would think. But this is what he took with him to La Trappe when he became regular abbot. And this was the foundation of the reform. Now, those of you who are in fact Cistercian will know, of course, that the rule of St. Benedict prohibits the eating of four-footed animals. It doesn't actually prohibit eating fish, and it doesn't actually prohibit eating two-footed creatures, apart from human beings, which don't taste too good. But four-footed animals, the quadrupeds, are forbidden. Now, By this time, there were many Cistercian houses which were ignoring this view and were in fact eating the meat of four-footed animals. This was the beginning of the real split between what later would be called the strict observance and the common observance, which is now known as the Order of Cita, but at the time it became known as the common observance. In the early days, the terms were different. What would become the strict observance are known as the abstinence, and those who didn't were regarded as not abstinent. But there's no question about it that the rule of St. Benedict does in fact prohibit the eating of four-footed creatures, and there's no doubt equally about it that there were many monasteries where this rule was ignored. Rancé reintroduces it, but he reintroduces it even more strictly than Benedict himself. Desert Fathers come in here. Rancé not only says that monks may not eat the flesh of four-footed animals, but also of birds and, under most circumstances, fish as well, and then goes into butter and eggs and all sorts of stuff on that. In his great book on the holiness and duties of the monastic life, he has a whole long chapter. Rancé's chapters are by definition long. Everybody's chapters at this time, remember, are long. They're a verbose people. And he goes on, it's amusing, he goes on a great length about what it means to be four-footed and why, in fact, he is introducing a stricture against two-footed birds with 2 feet and fish and all the rest of it. And you can tell that he's not writing for his monks. He's writing for an outside audience here, because he goes on, introduces, for example, 2 different Greek words for this, and then he brings in Greek writers from Greek dictionaries. This is an extremely learned disquisition with lots of Greek etymologies as to exactly why he's doing what he is. And you can imagine, I mean, he never preached this to his monks at La Trappe. They wouldn't have had a clue what he was talking about. It's designed for the audience outside, because by this time, as we'll see in another conference, by this time people were fascinated by what was going on at La Trappe. They were fascinated by Rancé, and they were fascinated by what was going on at La Trappe. One of the problems that Rancé had when he became abbot and was governing the abbey was keeping visitors away. It was hard to find. You had to have a guide to get there. But people still wanted to come to La Trappe and see just what this strict observance was about, because he's bringing back the rule, he's bringing back the silence of the rule. The great silence of La Trappe was silence, bringing back strict, not just the rule, but more than the rule, a strictest vegetarianism possible. And that has gone on down, of course, into the Cistercian tradition. What does the rule demand? Prayer. Above all, liturgical prayer. And for Rancé, liturgical prayer was the key to the Cistercian life. This too is something I want to speak more about a little later when I talk about Rancé's approach to Rancé's unmystical approach to the Cistercian tradition, very different from that of his hero, Bernard of Clairvaux. He loved Bernard. He says that what Bernard said was more important than that of 1,000 other writers. But nevertheless, he doesn't altogether go with Bernard in some of the areas that Bernard wanted to go, and that we'll see in due course. Now let's return to his time at La Trappe. He's gone to La Trappe as regular abbot. He has introduced the reform based on Julian Paris and the Desert Fathers. Go back to the rule of St. Benedict, but the rule of St. Benedict, there's no question about it, rule of St. Benedict reinterpreted by Rancé in some ways in a stricter way than Benedict himself demanded. There's still more to be said than the rule later, but for the moment the reform was hard. And those who objected to the reform, I'll use the common observance for convenience at the time, objected to it very strongly, very, very strongly indeed. As far as Rancé was concerned, the common observance introduced far too many mitigations and far too many dispensations from the rule, especially, of course, in the matter of diet. And the common observance, what the common observance saw in Rancé's demand that the rule be followed more strictly, was an overall condemnation of their way of life. In other words, what they saw was Rancé saying, you are wrong in everything. What they heard was a total condemnation of what they'd been doing for centuries, of what they were still doing, and worshipping, as far as they were concerned, worshipping God in their own way. And of course, the conflict between them therefore became really, really very, very difficult indeed. Both sides produced, therefore, pamphlets to defend themselves. And by pamphlets, I mean a minimum of, say, 300 pages, closely printed. Huge war was Louis Lacaille, who was a member of the Order of Cîteaux and couldn't stand Rancé, details, in fact, a bibliography of the pamphlet war, what became known as the War of the Observances, the strict observance versus the common observance. Huge amounts of print appeared in this, neither side being convinced at all of it. Neither side having, the documents had no impact one way or the other, and except for the very occasional conversions, one might say, the Rancé's strict observance and the common observance remained absolutely, harshly, totally apart. Both sides hating each other with a truly Christian holy hatred. That was the way it was, and that's the way, in fact, it will continue, with a few notable exceptions. Rancé's time as abbot, those 30 years he was abbot, therefore, were not easy. One of the problems was that Rancé was not a man to take criticism readily. He was a man who made enemies easily. Sometimes it was the fault of the enemy, sometimes it was Rancé's fault. As I said, he did not take criticism easily, and if in fact he thought he had been offended, if he thought he had been wronged, he would produce a volume to say how it was so. Wordy, verbose volumes, some of which are extremely tiresome, very tedious, and do not depict either Rancé or his opponents, we'll say more about this shortly, in any way, in any good light at all. Christian charity is singly lacking in some of the material which came out of La Trappe at this time. So his time as abbot was not easy, sometimes because of his own making, sometimes because of the misunderstandings that got around as to what, in fact, La Trappe was doing. Misunderstandings, I might add, that are still shared by sisters of strict observance today. And in my next conference, what I'm going to do is to have a look at some of the major conflicts that Rancé had to deal with in his years as abbot. And those, apart from the inevitable, ongoing, unresolvable conflict with the so-called common observance, there were, in fact, 3 other conflicts which we need to say a word or two about, which we won't do now, but we will do in a moment. There was a conflict with another abbot on the question of what were called technically humiliations or fictions. There was a quarrel with the Carthusians about whether they actually had any need to be reformed. And there was a big, major quarrel with Dom Jean Mabillon, the great Moorish scholar, about the question of monastic studies. Those are the 3 big ones. Now, at the moment, you may not know too much about them, but after I finish the next conference, you certainly will know a very great deal more.
We can